We gave a street dog a new home. His transformation is incredible. I never expected one cold, gray morning in the middle of street to change my life, or to leave me trembling with anticipation about what was to come. But that was precisely what happened. I'd stepped outside with the sole intention of taking a brief walk before the hustle of the day swallowed me. Little did I know I was about to encounter something so unusual, so raw, that it would grip my heart in an unrelenting fist of both dread and hope. Rain fell in chilly, stinging droplets that made the sidewalk glisten with a metallic sheen under the dull early light. My breath formed tiny clouds, and the air smelled of damp concrete and faint gasoline fumes. Halfway down the block, I saw a shape move, a small, shaking silhouette beneath a battered cardboard box. It was too tiny to be human, but not so small that I could dismiss it as a random piece of debris. As I stepped closer, I heard a whimper. My heart jolted. Through the broken flaps of the box, two terrified eyes stared back at me. The dog was not just lost, he was on the edge of giving up, lying there as though he had chosen that spot to exit the world quietly. Something in those sorrowful eyes bound me to him in that instant. I couldn't simply walk away. I knelt down, water seeping through my jeans, ignoring the chill that pricked at my skin. The dog was skinny, so thin I could trace his ribs just by looking. His fur, matted and torn out in patches, revealed raw skin and signs of infection. Every inch of him told a tragic story. The missing chunks of fur, the caked mud around his paws, and the ear that looked like it had been torn in a fight. A muffled cough came from his tiny body, as though his lungs could no longer keep up with the harsh city air. There was a limp in his hind leg, too. This dog, whoever he once was, now existed as a battered shell, on a thread of survival so fragile that a single gust of wind might have blown it away. I felt an urgent surge of emotion, something more potent than pity, anger perhaps, at a world that had let him get to this point. But who was I to blame? Homelessness wasn't uncommon for dogs or humans in this city. Yet the look in his eyes demanded acknowledgement. He wasn't just any stray. He was a fighter who had clung to life despite odds stacked insanely high against him. And if he had the courage to keep fighting, then surely I could muster the courage to help him. I whispered soft words, unsure if he understood but hoping he might catch the gentleness in my voice. His eyes blinked, and I took it as permission to gently slip my hands around his frail body. That was the first time I realized how emaciated he truly was. He weighed almost nothing. It was as if I was holding a frail bird. His tiny heart fluttered in my palms, uncertain, yet clinging to hope. The moment I lifted him, a soft whimper slipped from his throat and I could feel a flood of guilt. I was a stranger, lifting him from his meager shelter, but I had to take that chance. I cradled him against my coat, and he sank into the warmth with a trembling acceptance. Unsure if he'd make it another hour on the street, I hurried back to my apartment. That frantic walk back felt like a race against time. Rain pounded the pavement, each drop echoing like a warning. Hurry, hurry, hurry. I kept my coat around him, shielding him from the worst of the weather, whispering reassurances I wasn't fully sure I believed. A cocktail of worry, fear, and fierce protectiveness stirred inside me. My only goal was to reach home before something irreparable happened. When I arrived, I carefully placed him on a soft towel in the kitchen. Under the bright light, the extent of his wounds was even clearer. His paws were bloody with open sores, and fleas crawled along his ears and stomach. This neglect was so profound that my chest tightened in anger and sadness. I wondered how many people had walked past him and chosen to ignore his silent pleas. I filled a bowl with warm water, located some antiseptic wipes, and rummaged for gauze. The dog looked up at me with fearful eyes, his tail tucked so tightly between his legs that it nearly brushed his belly. I whispered, "I'm here now, okay? I won't hurt you." Each word felt like a promise, one I had no idea if I could keep, but one I was determined to honor. Cleaning his wounds was a delicate, heartbreaking task. Every time I pressed a wipe to his skin, he let out a small yelp. Yet beneath the pain there was a faint spark of trust. His eyes never left mine, as though he was reading my every move to decide whether I was friend or foe. The water in the bowl turned murky gray. Blood and dirt stained the towels. My hands shook, but I tried to be gentle. I washed away layer after layer of grime, revealing an even more fragile creature underneath. His body was a road map of old scars and new wounds, a testament to a life that had known more fear than affection. Night fell, but neither of us slept much. I stayed beside him, draping him in a warm blanket and placing a small dish of water next to him. He could barely lift his head to drink, so I gently guided his muzzle toward the bowl. Every successful sip felt like a small victory, a sign he hadn't given up entirely. I called the local animal rescue hotline, but it was late, and all I got was a recorded message. The next morning, I'd try a vet. Until then, I was all he had, and he was all I could think about. His shallow breathing worried me. As hours passed, my mind spiraled with scenarios. What if he had pneumonia? What if he had internal injuries? What if he closed his eyes and never woke up again? I didn't realize how physically and emotionally drained I was until my own body collapsed into a restless doze beside him. Every so often he whimpered, and I'd bolt upright, heart pounding, to check if he was still with me. He always was, blinking at me with a strange acceptance that whispered, "I'm here, but I'm tired." Through it all, I mumbled promises of healing, of warmth, of a better life. It was a strange prayer, directed at a dog I'd only known for a few hours, but somehow it felt like I'd been waiting to help him my entire life. When the first rays of sunlight finally broke through my window, streaking the floor with golden lines, I felt a renewed sense of urgency. I wrapped him in a makeshift sling and headed to the vet. The city was coming alive around us, people on their way to work, cafes opening their doors, traffic picking up. The dog trembled in my arms, overwhelmed by the sound of honking horns and the blur of passing faces. My heart pounded like a drum against my ribs. Please, let this little life hold on. That was my single, desperate thought. At the vet's office, the receptionist took one look at the dog and rushed us into an exam room. My explanation spilled out in a frantic rush. How I'd found him, his condition, my fears that I'd waited too long to get him help. The vet, a gentle woman named Dr. Marshall, examined him carefully. She poked and prodded with a kind of compassionate precision that told me she'd seen tragedies like this before. His eyes fluttered, but he tried to remain still, as if he understood this was important. After what felt like an eternity, Dr. Marshall turned to me with a grave expression. "He's severely underweight, dehydrated, and infected with fleas and ticks. Some of his wounds are infected too. He'll need antibiotics, fluids, and potentially more intensive treatment." I asked the question that had haunted me from the moment I'd picked him up. "Is he going to make it?" Dr. Marshall paused, pressing her lips together. "It's going to be a battle, but let's give him a chance." Relief flooded my system and I felt my knees weaken. A chance. That was all I needed to hear. She started him on IV fluids and antibiotics right away. I waited in the lobby, biting my fingernails until they were raw. The smell of antiseptic and the nervous hush of others waiting with their own pets formed a tense backdrop. After several hours, Dr. Marshall emerged to let me know he was stable enough to go home that evening, but required intensive care, pain meds, careful feeding, and a sterile environment. I named him Apollo that same night, after the god of healing and the sun, silently praying he could find strength in that name. Even though I had no idea if he'd live to see another week, giving him a name felt like an affirmation of life. It was a symbolic act, a declaration of faith in his future. And maybe, on a deeper level, it was my own vow to protect him with everything I had. We set up a small recovery area in my apartment. Every hour on the hour I checked his wounds, gave him medication, and coaxed him to drink water. His appetite was almost non-existent at first, but with patience, and some homemade chicken broth, he started licking at the bowl. Each tiny sip or nibble felt like a massive triumph. Days bled into weeks in a blur of sleepless nights, medication schedules, and cautious hope. There were moments I feared I'd fail him, especially when his fever spiked one night, leaving him shivering uncontrollably. I rushed him back to the vet, tears blurring my vision, convinced I was about to lose him. He survived that night, clinging to life by the narrowest margin, pulling through as though guided by a stubborn will not to leave me yet. Slowly, incredibly, Apollo began to show signs of improvement. The crust around his eyes lessened, and the deep, hacking cough that tore through his lungs grew softer. The raw patches on his skin started to heal beneath careful treatments and ointments. His fur remained patchy, but for the first time I could imagine what he might look like whole, vibrant, strong, full of a life he'd been for so long. Every day brought a tiny victory. The first time he wagged his tail, a short, tentative wag that lit me up with immeasurable joy. The first time he managed to stand without toppling over. The first time he licked my hand in what felt like genuine affection rather than desperate survival. It wasn't all smooth sailing. His spirit bore the weight of trauma. Loud noises would send him cowering under the table. A raised hand, even in play, might cause him to flinch as though expecting a blow. Slowly, carefully, I tried to show him that not all hands hurt, not every shout signaled danger, and that love was something he could trust. I remember the day I decided to take him for his first short walk outside. He had healed enough to step onto the sidewalk without whining in pain. The city was still his largest trigger, the bustle and clamor reminding him of a place where he'd been neglected and scorned. But he was curious, his nose twitching at every scent wafting by. He moved with a trembling excitement. He stuck close to my legs, glancing up now and then as if to confirm I was still there. If a stranger passed by, he shrank back. If a car horn blared, he froze. But each time I knelt down, placed a reassuring hand on his back, and reminded him that he wasn't alone. He seemed to absorb my calm, step by shaky step, as though leaning on my faith in him to keep going. That first outing was exhausting for both of us, but I'll never forget the moment we returned to my apartment. The door closed behind us, and for a split second, Apollo looked up at me with an expression that nearly broke me. Relief, gratitude, and perhaps the dawning realization that this place was now his refuge. He took a few hesitant steps to his makeshift bed by the heater and curled up. His eyes followed me as I moved around, as though I was his anchor. In that moment, I knew I was entirely, irreversibly in love with this battered little warrior. Soon, the neighbors started noticing him. People who had known me would do a double-take when they saw the matted dog at my side. Some voiced mild horror at his initial appearance, while others offered a sympathetic pat, which Apollo tolerated with cautious acceptance. Rumors circulated around the building about the miracle dog. A few neighbors even asked if they could help in any way, bringing old blankets, dog food samples, and heartfelt well wishes. Apollo was shy but never aggressive, and I noticed him relaxing a bit more around strangers. Perhaps he was starting to believe that not every human would hurt him. Perhaps he was daring to hope. As Apollo grew stronger, he developed playful quirks, a gentle nuzzle against my hand when he wanted attention, a funny snort whenever he stretched in the morning. He'd chase dust particles in the living room, stumbling clumsily over his still healing paws. He found infinite fascination in an old tennis ball, though he wasn't quite sure how to properly fetch. Instead, he'd clumsily push it around with his nose, occasionally barking at it as if it were an uncooperative friend. Each silly moment was a testament to resilience, a reminder that life could still surprise us with wonder if we allowed it. My own life began to revolve around Apollo's rehabilitation. Work took a backseat, social outings became infrequent. My phone brimmed with images and videos of him, from the day he could barely lift his head to the day he tried to run for the first time, his legs shaky, but his tail wagging furiously. Strangers online, people I'd never met, were following his journey after I posted a brief story about him on social media. Messages of support poured in from all over, people rooting for him, inspired by his fight, some sharing stories of their own rescues. Apollo's story seemed to resonate, awakening compassion in hearts far beyond our little corner of the city. Just when I thought we were nearing a stable plateau, everything changed on a Wednesday afternoon. I'd been out getting groceries, content in the knowledge that Apollo could be left alone for short periods without issue. When I returned and opened the door, the entire apartment felt wrong, too quiet, too still. My stomach twisted with immediate dread. I set the groceries down and called out, "Apollo." No response. Panic surged through me. I found him lying in his bed, breathing hard, eyes unfocused. His body felt hot, feverish. It was reminiscent of the night I'd almost lost him. I scooped him up, ignoring the groceries scattered across the floor, and raced to the vet, mind spiraling with worst-case scenarios. Dr. Marshall ran a barrage of tests. She suspected a hidden infection or a complication from his earlier injuries. Hours felt like days as I paced the waiting room. When she finally emerged, the news was sobering. A lingering bacterial infection had spread. Apollo needed urgent intravenous medication and close observation. It was a second blow, a reminder that healing was never linear, that trauma lodged deep can flare up when we least expect it. I felt tears burning my eyes. I was powerless, forced to place my trust in the vet's skilled hands while I prayed, silently and fiercely, for his survival. The look on Dr. Marshall's face mirrored my own fear, but also a determination not to give up on him. That night I stayed at the clinic, dozing in an uncomfortable plastic chair outside the recovery room. Every beep of the medical monitor made my heart lurch. Memories flooded my mind, scooping him up off the street, his first timid tail wag, the countless nights we spent side by side. The thought of losing him now felt like an unimaginable betrayal of all he'd fought for. Dawn broke in a wash of pale orange light over the clinic windows. Dr. Marshall emerged, exhaustion etched into her features. She gave me a small smile. "He's fighting and it's working. His fever broke an hour ago." Relief crashed over me in waves. I had to press a hand against the wall to steady myself. A tear slipped down my cheek as I whispered, "Thank you." Apollo remained under close watch for 3 days. Every day I visited him, he perked up a little more. By the time he was ready to go home, he greeted me with a weak but determined wag, as though even this setback couldn't break his spirit. The entire staff at the clinic seemed enamored with him. They called him the Wonder Dog, praising his tenacity. I carried him out to the car, and though he was still weak, I could sense a new resilience in him, something that said, "I won't be beaten. Not now, not ever." Back home, our routine deepened. Medication schedules, gentle walks, balanced meals. Every aspect of my day revolved around ensuring Apollo had everything he needed. But in a strange twist, caring for him brought healing to my own life, too. The heartbreaks and stressors I'd carried before had receded, overshadowed by the simple, profound act of nurturing another living being. It was like we were healing each other in tandem. I felt less alone, more grounded and unexpectedly open to life's small wonders. As Apollo's health stabilized, his personality began to shine. He was mischievous at times, stealing socks from the laundry basket and parading them around the living room. He'd wag his tail proudly, waiting for me to chase after him. A playful light danced in his eyes, something I never thought I'd see in that first week when he was close to death. His coat started growing back, soft and golden brown, with dark patches near his ears. His once sunken eyes now sparkled with warmth, scanning the environment with curiosity rather than fear. Neighbors who had once his condition now exclaimed how different he looked, how bright his presence was. Some even joked that I'd replaced the pitiful stray with a brand new dog. But it was still Apollo, just a version of him that was no longer weighed down by hunger and pain. And as his transformation became increasingly visible, people in the neighborhood started asking about his journey. Word spread fast. A few local children asked if they could pet him. And to my delight, Apollo loved kids. He was gentle, patient, and seemed to adore the simple attention of a smaller, kinder world than the one he'd known before. One sunny afternoon, something remarkable happened. We were in the local park, a quiet spot with green lawns and tall trees. Apollo was sniffing around, his nose buried in a patch of clover when he suddenly bolted. My heart lurched, but instead of running away from me, he sprinted toward a group of children playing ball. Alarmed, I dashed after him, terrified he might be overwhelmed and react badly. To my amazement, he joined their game, nudging the ball with his nose. The children squealed with delight and Apollo hopped about, tail wagging in pure glee. My eyes blurred with tears. Here was the dog who once cowered at every footstep, now embracing joy so freely it took my breath away. He reminded me, in that moment, of all the resilience in the world that we sometimes overlook. When I called him to me, he bounded back with his tongue lolling out as if to say, "Did you see that? I'm living." Emboldened by his progress, I decided to share his story more widely online. The short clips and photos I posted began to go viral. People couldn't believe the transformation. The gaunt, trembling creature from the cardboard box was now a confident, vibrant dog. Messages poured in from across the globe. Some shared tears, others shared joy. Many thanked me for reminding them that compassion still existed. Companies offered free dog food, grooming sessions, and even free checkups. Local newspapers wanted to interview me about Apollo's journey. It was surreal, but also heartwarming. Our story seemed to carry a message of hope that transcended our little neighborhood. However, not everyone's response was positive. I received a message from a man claiming that Apollo had once belonged to him, that Apollo had run away during a storm, and that he wanted him back. My blood ran cold. I looked at Apollo curled at my feet, my mind flashing back to the severe neglect I had witnessed. Could this person be the one who'd let him get into such a terrible state? The man provided a few photos of a dog that vaguely looked like Apollo, though the dog in the images was healthier and younger. I felt an icy fury build in my chest, but also a deep dread. If this man had some legal claim, would I be forced to give Apollo back to a situation that had harmed him? I responded carefully, asking detailed questions. The man's replies were evasive, contradictory, and ultimately didn't match Apollo's unique scars or markings. Something about his story wasn't adding up. Dr. Marshall's own report had indicated that Apollo's injuries and neglect were long-term. It was unlikely he had belonged to someone who truly cared for him. And so, with trembling resolve, I consulted a local legal advisor and the vet's documentation, ensuring I had proof of the medical journey that showed how long and how severely Apollo had been neglected. Eventually, the man stopped responding to my inquiries. It felt like a bullet dodged, a brief but sharp reminder that not everyone is moved by compassion, and some might see a viral story as an opportunity for attention or gain. If anything, that incident might vow, no one would ever hurt Apollo again. Time passed in a quiet, life-affirming routine. Apollo's patchy fur grew into a beautiful coat of soft, golden-brown hair. His eyes were bright and inquisitive. He learned commands quickly: sit, stay, come, though he liked to add his own flair, sometimes tilting his head as if questioning why exactly he should follow a human's instruction. Each day we took a stroll down street, revisiting the corner where I'd found him. He'd sniff around curiously, but he never lingered. I often wondered what he remembered of that day. Did the scent of wet cardboard trigger any memories of desperation? Or was he moving on, leaving the ghosts of his past behind? In the spring, an opportunity arose that both thrilled and terrified me. A local shelter hosted an adoption fair, and they wanted me to bring Apollo as a sort of for rescue pets. My immediate reaction was to protect him. Crowds could be stressful, and I didn't want him to regress. But after giving it some thought, and noticing how well he did with our neighbors and their children, I decided it might be a chance to spread our message, that every creature, no matter how battered, deserves a chance at life. The day of the fair was a swirl of bright banners, balloons, and excited families. The air buzzed with chatter and the occasional bark. Apollo seemed overwhelmed at first, his ears pinned back as he tried to make sense of all the commotion. But as people approached us, curious about his story, he sensed their warmth. He let children pet him, even giving out a few tender licks. Adults listened intently, eyes moistening when I recounted how I'd found him. Throughout the event, I stressed the importance of empathy, urging people to see past a dog's tattered exterior. Apollo, living proof of transformation, lay calmly by my feet, soaking up the attention without fear. It was a triumphant moment for both of us, a public affirmation of hope over neglect, love over cruelty. Towards the end of the fair, a young boy, no older than 9, approached with a battered baseball cap in his hands. He stared at Apollo with a kind of awe, then reached out slowly, giving Apollo's head a gentle pat. "Thank you for helping him," the boy said, eyes shining. Before I could respond, the boy pressed a few crumpled dollars into my hand. "For dog treats," he whispered, cheeks flushing. My heart swelled. I knelt down to meet his gaze and handed the money back. "How about you use this to buy treats for another dog at the shelter today?" I suggested gently. The boy smiled, nodded fiercely, and ran off with his mother trailing behind. I looked down at Apollo, and in his calm, trusting eyes, I saw a reflection of my own wonder. We had inspired a spark of kindness in a child. Maybe that was how real change began, with small gestures that echo far beyond what we can see. By the time we returned home, we were both exhausted. Apollo sauntered to his favorite spot by the window, the sun streaming in, warming him. I sank into the couch, running my hands over my face. A swirl of emotions danced in my chest, pride, relief, a lingering thread of disbelief that this was the same dog who had almost died in my arms. My mind drifted to the uncertain future. What if he got sick again? What if I failed him in some way? But then I looked at him, happily dozing in the sun. Fear shouldn't overshadow this moment. Every day had become precious, filled with a renewed sense of gratitude. Apollo was a survivor. Together, we would face whatever came next. Weeks turned into months. The city slid into the humid heat of summer, then gently fell into crisp autumn air. Apollo and I continued our walks, sometimes venturing farther, across the park, past the river, and onto quiet trails where he could roam, sniffing at leaves and chasing after squirrels. No matter where we went, he remained attuned to my presence, always circling back to check if I was still there, as if he feared losing me as well. Yet each day his confidence grew. He'd run ahead, ears flopping and tongue lolling, the picture of canine happiness. I'd follow behind, marveling at how far he'd come. People began to refer to him as a local celebrity. And on more than one occasion, we were stopped by someone who recognized Apollo from social media. They'd comment on how radiant and healthy he looked, sometimes tearing up when they recalled the pictures of him near death. Apollo would greet them with a gentle way, pressing his nose into their hands. If they had treats, all the better. But never once did he forget to glance back at me, a silent check-in that filled me with more affection than words could express. Autumn slowly gave way to winter. The first snow of the season came in a flurry of white flakes, dusting the city in a fragile, shimmering blanket. Apollo had never seen snow before, and his reaction was priceless. He bounded into the yard behind my apartment building, trying to catch snowflakes on his tongue. He pawed at the soft layer on the ground, left baffled when his footprints melted away. His coat was now fully grown, thick enough to keep him warm, though I'd bought him a little dog jacket just in case. Seeing him bounce around, full of wonder, I was struck by an unexpected wave of emotion. I remembered how I'd first found him, cold, hungry, and alone in the rain-soaked streets. Now he was prancing in the snow like a pup who'd never known hardship. Perhaps that was the greatest gift, the chance to start anew, free from the chains of the past. But life, ever unpredictable, decided to throw one final test our way. One evening, just as the wind howled outside and I was considering turning up the heat, there was a frantic knock at my door. I opened it to find a young woman cradling a limp, frost-bitten kitten in her arms. She lived a few floors up and had seen my social media posts about Apollo. She begged me for help, tears streaming down her face. The kitten, she said, was found shivering by a dumpster, looking barely alive. My heart clenched with a fierce. I ushered her in, quickly grabbing towels and a small heater. Apollo stood by my side, ears pricked, alert to the crisis. He approached the kitten gingerly, nose twitching. There was no aggression, only curiosity and, I believed, empathy. Perhaps he recognized in that tiny, frozen body a reflection of himself, what he once was and what he had narrowly escaped. We did our best to warm the kitten, but she was in critical condition. My mind spun with the memory of all the nights I sat up with Apollo, praying he'd pull through. Without hesitation, I said, "We need to get her to the emergency vet." The young woman and I braved the biting cold outside. Apollo wanted to come too, standing by the door with anxious eyes. I didn't have the heart to leave him behind, so I bundled him up and brought him along. At the clinic, the vet repeated a cycle of checks and treatments so reminiscent of Apollo's own experience. I felt my heart lurch each time the kitten whimpered, the sound painfully reminiscent of the helpless cries Apollo once made. 2 hours later, the vet stabilized the kitten, though cautioned that she was not out of danger. The young woman, whose name I learned seemed overwhelmed. She admitted she wasn't sure she could handle the responsibility if the kitten survived. She had a meager income and little experience with animals. I found myself at a crossroads. Could I take on another life in need? Part of me hesitated, remembering the emotional roller coaster Apollo and I had navigated. But when I looked at Apollo, who gazed at the kitten with a gentle, almost protective curiosity, I felt a stirring of conviction. Perhaps this was our destiny. We knew the path from desperation to hope. Who better to guide another creature? Ultimately, promised to help as much as she could, offering to contribute financially and be a co-caretaker if I'd take primary responsibility for the kitten. I agreed, my heart pounding with the magnitude of the decision. Over the next weeks, the kitten, whom we named Luna, clung to life, showing gradual improvement much like Apollo once had. Apollo took on the role of a gentle guardian, never aggressive, always watchful. I'd find him curling around her carrier as though standing guard. There were times when Luna, frightened by a sudden noise, would hiss and arch her back, but Apollo would just wag his tail, unconcerned, offering a calming presence. As Luna's health improved, I could see a new dynamic in our home. Apollo had become the teacher, the reassuring presence that convinced Luna the world wasn't so terrifying. Once she was strong enough to walk around, Luna followed Apollo everywhere, batting playfully at his tail. He'd indulge her, occasionally nudging her with his nose as if to say, "It's okay, little one. You're safe here." Watching them was like witnessing the full circle of compassion. A dog once dying in a box on street, now helping a tiny kitten find her place in the world. One frosty evening, as I sat on the couch with a cup of tea, Apollo hopped up beside me. Luna, still small and delicate, curled up on the other side. The apartment was quiet, lit only by the soft glow of a single lamp. Outside, the wind howled past our windows, swirling snow across the glass. I stroked Apollo's ears, then scratched under Luna's chin. My mind drifted through everything that had happened. The cruelty that nearly took Apollo's life, the miraculous resilience that pulled him through, the wave of compassion and love that had blossomed in our community. Now, with Luna safe, we were living proof that hope can sprout in the most desolate of places. In that quiet moment, I felt tears slip down my cheeks, tears of gratitude and awe. The memory of finding Apollo was no longer a crushing weight. It was now a shining testament to what empathy could achieve. The extremes we'd faced, despair, fear, heartbreak, had given birth to a warmth in my life I never could have anticipated. And it wasn't just about me caring for them. They had changed me, too. Apollo's unwavering spirit taught me about courage in the face of unspeakable odds. Luna's fragile beginning reminded me of life's delicacy, urging me never to grow complacent in my compassion. Together, we formed a strange, patchwork family, forged by adversity and held together by love. And so, if you asked me how Apollo's transformation happened, I wouldn't just recount antibiotics and warm blankets. The real transformation, both his and mine, lay in the silent moments when fear gave way to trust, when pain gave way to comfort, and when hopelessness melted into gentle, steadfast devotion. Love, I learned, is not a mere sentiment. It's a choice we make every day, an action we take for someone who might not even understand our language but understands our heart. And in choosing it, we open the door to miracles. That's why when I share Apollo's story, I don't just say we saved him. He saved us too. He saved us from indifference, from a life so wrapped in our own concerns that we forget others in need. In him, I found purpose, and in sharing that purpose with the world, I discovered connections that spanned oceans and continents. People wrote to me about their own rescues, about how Apollo's journey inspired them to open their homes to strays, to volunteer at shelters, to adopt rather than buy. Our small act of compassion rippled outward, touching lives in ways I never could have anticipated when I lifted that soggy cardboard flap on a rainy street. Even now, as I watch Apollo and Luna doze in a patch of morning sunlight, I'm struck by how drastically life can shift in a single heartbeat. I remember the first time I saw Apollo's eyes, full of sorrow and confusion, and I see now the spark of joy and peace reflected in them. The journey wasn't neat or easy. It was filled with messes, literal and metaphorical, countless vet visits, near-death moments, sleepless nights, and heartbreak that still leaves a dull ache in my chest. But that ache is a testament to caring, to risking your heart for another being. If anything, it's the most human thing about us. Sometimes, when I'm walking Apollo through our neighborhood, we pass that same spot where he once lay under a tattered cardboard box. He'll glance toward the corner, sniff the air, and then look up at me. I don't know if he remembers the exact moment his life changed, but I like to think there's a part of him that does, a part that is grateful, as I am, that we were given this extraordinary chance. I kneel and scratch behind his ears, whispering, "We made it, buddy." His tail wags slowly, as though he understands. Our story reminds me that transformations can happen anywhere at any time. Whether it's a dog on a cold street or a human locked in their own emotional struggles, hope can rise unexpectedly when kindness intervenes. And that hope, once ignited, can spread like a blaze, warming others who come in contact with it. Apollo is living proof. And I, once an ordinary person consumed by the day-to-day grind, became part of something bigger, an unspoken pact between all living beings who dare to care for one another. In that sense, Apollo's transformation is incredible not just because he survived, but because of how many hearts he has touched and continues to touch. If there's one lasting message I want people to take from his story, it's that no creature is ever truly too far gone. Scars, physical or emotional, do not define us. Love does. In a world often numbed by cruelty and despair, each act of compassion is a beam of light. We can choose to see or ignore suffering, but if we choose to see it, if we choose to act, we become the stewards of miracles. The price is vulnerability, the risk that our hearts might break. But sometimes in that breaking, we find the truest pieces of ourselves, the parts that connect us to everyone else. That's the lesson Apollo taught me. That the bravest thing we can do is open ourselves to another's pain, and in doing so, heal a part of our own. And I hope, in sharing his tale, that more people will be inspired to do just that, to look beneath the grime and hurt, to find the treasure of a life worth saving. Because if you do, you might just find yourself transformed right alongside them.